In this webinar, we look into learning from Ghana's economic crisis. For much of the 21st century, Ghana has been regarded as a role model in terms of its relatively well-functioning institutions and sensible economic policies. Recent events, including its current bailout from the World Bank, have alarmed many. What lessons can be learned from Ghana's predicament for other economies? Our hosts, Professor Rajneesh Narula and the Dean and Director of Henley Business School Africa, John Foster Pedley, will be joined by our panelists. Dunning Africa Centre. It's not a place, it's a continent-wide conversation. Join us on the first Thursday of every month.
Excellent. Welcome to another Thursday, the first Thursday of the month, which means it's time for the Dunning Africa Centre webinar. Delighted to have our usual almost bursting audience, excitement, of course, building up under the circumstances. The conversation has definitely in the continent moved to Africa and to West Africa in particular. We've had, the conversation going on in the beginning of the year and late last year about Ghana's economic crisis. Of course, yesterday we have been talking about the elections in Nigeria, and it's a busy period for us. And of course, all eyes have turned to the West Coast. So I'm delighted to take us a step back, move away from politics per se, to talk about something that is much more important and much more significant in the big picture, and that is Ghana's economic crisis. And I'm very, very lucky to have a couple of excellent speakers. We are very lucky to have John Foster Pedley is joining me today as co-host. And we've got two excellent speakers. We have Kofi Bentil, at the good look on my left. I don't know which side he is. He will appear on in a few minutes. Kofi, I don't want to go, and by the time I read out his entire CV, the session will be over. So I'm going to stick to the highlights. And the highlight being he's a lawyer, a lecturer, a consultant, and of course an activist. And he's involved in a lot of political issues, mass movement, causes. He's a man with a finger on the pulse of the nation. And he's also, his main job, the one that I presume puts bread on the table, is as a lawyer. And he runs a practice in Ghana called Lex Praxis Incorporated. He's also got a consultancy company, and he's Senior Vice President, Policy Analyst for Imani Ghana, which is a major think tank. And, there are a lot of really good people that are part of that team. So, welcome, Kofi. I'm really glad you found the time to come out and speak to us today.
Thank you very much, Rajneesh.
Thank you. And our second, and by no means last, less important speaker is Ziad Hamoui, who we've had here in the past. And Ziad is a chartered logistician, and we had him here last time because he's a very a powerful advocate for regional integration. He's been involved in building up the issues associated with Pan-Africanism, and in particular the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And he has a lot to say about that. He's been involved in logistics and transport in Ghana for 2 decades. And it's, again, a man who knows a lot of things about a lot of topics. So we won't be short of words once again from him. So I'm really delighted that we have these two people here. Now, to give you some context of today's thing, as always, we are really trying to talk to the man on the street, so to speak. I'm not necessarily trying to address only intellectuals and so forth, as some people think that, that people in business schools and universities do. But we're really trying to look at things at kind of at the intelligent person's perspective. And from an intelligent person's perspective, the interesting thing about Ghana was a success story. Everywhere you turned, Until recently, when you said Ghana, you said, well, that's a success story. Africa, West Africa success story. And all the countries around would say, why can't we be like Ghana when we grow up? And I myself made a trip to Accra, and I was, it reminded me of Nigeria in the good old days, so to speak. And I thought, wow, this is what we used to be like, and why can't we come back here again? So it came as a shock to those of us who aren't macroeconomists and studying, the detail of the Ghanaian economy, that suddenly we're hearing rumors that there's going to be a bailout. The IMF is involved, the World Bank is involved, renegotiating debt. And, it kind of took us aback. And in fact, a number of of people in the audience whom I know were kind of also shocked that this was not something we expected. So that's where we are starting from. And, we want to look into not necessarily take an economics analysis of the causes, but to understand a little bit of kind of how things change so rapidly. And then, of course, looking not necessarily to put blame on anyone's door, but to say, what are the lessons learned? How can Nigeria, how can Sierra Leone, how can, other countries, not just in the region, but across Africa, learn from this experience? And again, Ghana itself, how can Ghana learn from this experience? So that's where the conversation today will be about. Now, as usual, I'm going to, we're going to let people kind of express themselves without slides, without too much jargon, and we'll take the conversation where it may. The chat function is open. Anyone in the audience who wants to ask a question or raise an important point, please do so. Feel free to do so. We are here and we want to listen and to hear from you. So let me turn to Kofi to begin. What do you make of this situation? What's your take on the situation?
Well, thank you. The situation is bad on paper. It's bad on paper because we've never been here, at least not in my lifetime. And if we don't get a handle on it and turn it around quickly, what we have said based on our analysis in Imani is that we had, a fiscal problem, which we didn't handle well. That became an economic problem. And the economic problem, if we don't handle it well, will soon become a national security problem. So you have this kind of escalation. So it's bad on paper. But I always tell people that why I say it's bad on paper is because if you are in Ghana now, you won't feel it. If you were here last December, you will be surprised that, this is a country celebrating at the highest. And so we are just hoping that it does not become, this national security crisis where now people have problems. I mean, we had senior citizens demonstrating because they were saying they needed their coupons, their interest paid so they could get medication. When you start getting stories of people who are losing their insulin and dialysis treatments because of some of these things, then you're going to get into real serious problem. When we get to places where civil servants cannot be paid, then you're going to get into real serious problem. So it's bad on paper. It is not, gotten to a certain point where we have a national security crisis yet, but we hope we don't get there. And I think that the first thing I'll say is that, so there's a saying that Rome was not built in a day. And a wise man said, Rome was not built in a day, it was built every day. The idea is that once you take your eyes off the ball, the things you take for granted can quickly unravel. And that's what has happened to Ghana. We've had such a long run of generally sensible economic management. We have places we don't stray into these areas of default. Default was never in the Ghanaian mindset. In my own lifetime, I've never seen it. And I never thought we would get to it. So I think it got into everybody's head all the way to the president. This thinking that we will really never default. But it's because we stopped building, we stopped doing the things that we did, the prudence that we observed, which made it not part of our track record. And by doing that, we ended up where we thought we would never get to. What it just tells us is that we should never take anything for granted, right? And that also goes into the other point I'll make about this, that myself included, the general Ghanaian populace gave this government too much credit, too much room to operate, and we just assumed that they would do the right things all the time, every time, because of their track record. And I think the lesson learned there is that no matter if an angel comes to you and says he's going to run your country, treat him as if you cannot trust him, and then hold him to accountability every day. And don't just expect him to do the right things, but make him do the right things. These are our friends. So these are some of the things that, I'll say as an initial commentary on why we are where we are. And I hope I have learned the lessons. I hope the whole country learns the lessons as well.
Thank you for that opening salvo. So give us a little bit of a background for those in the room who are not familiar with the credentials of the current government. I think that what made them seem to be untouchable or perfect or angelic in nature. Right. It's not a word normally used with politicians,
So if you take, say, the finance minister, who basically we entrusted the company. The finance minister is a Yale-trained banker. He actually came into Ghana in the worst economic crisis during the times we were having, hyperinflation. Everything was melting down. We had a huge exodus. Okay, he left the States to come into Ghana. At the time, we did not even have a developed market. So this is Keno Foriata. He came with his friends, borrowed $25,000, built a local investment banking firm, which he has built over almost 30 years into a formidable financial empire. Now, here is somebody who pulled himself up by his own bootstraps. Now, his father used to be a minister of economics, finance in Ghana, and we think a fairly successful economist. So he had a pedigree. He was sufficiently well trained. He had the credentials, but he did not go into government or use necessarily some of those connections. He went the hard way, built from the ground a financial institution which today is in managing billions of people's funds and is internationally recognized. Here is a guy who, in the first year of government, he was able to pick up a phone and call his friends in Templeton in the USA and raise $2.5 billion without much fuss. That is the kind of credibility he comes with. Now, this person I'm talking about, apart from all these things that he himself has done, comes from a family. If you take the currency in Ghana today, there are 6 people that we call the Big Six. 4 of those people come from his family, that one house. And essentially, these Big Six were the central part of the people who want independence for Ghana. Indeed, his uncle is the one who brought Kwame Nkrumah back from the States into Ghana. So you have people with this kind of history and political pedigree who also deliver on their own such stellar examples, and then he becomes the Minister of Finance. I mean, we were begging him to be Minister of Finance. Before he became Minister of Finance, the president asked publicly, he said, who in this country can you tell me is more qualified than Keno Foriata to be the Minister of Finance? And he said it when people said, by the way, this person is also the cousin of the president. So there were accusations of nepotism. And he said, tell me who in this whole country you think is better qualified than Keno Foriata. And there was no challenge. So you have this kind of pedigree for a Minister of Finance. And who am I to start questioning him about the choices he's making when the guy has been a successful investment banker for 30 years plus? He rescued insurance companies. I could go on and on, but you get the picture. And if you take the president himself, so in Ghana's history, like I said, the Big Six. So I told you that the Minister of Finance is the cousin of the president. The Big Six, 4 out of the Big Six comes from his house. The president's father was a president in Ghana. He has been a lawyer, constitutional lawyer. I could go on, but I think you can find that also online. Yeah, the pedigree was very clear.
Clear. That is clear now. I mean, thank you for putting that in context. And I can see how this would have been, as you say, obfuscates the challenges. And okay, so we're looking here at an issue about politics as well as economics. So there's a kind of chicken and the egg story. You pick the best people for the job, and one assumes that they will get on and do a great job. And then, but this is, and this is where I think Ziad, I know has thoughts about this. Is this essentially about accountability? Let me turn to Ziad for a couple of minutes on this.
Well, thank you, Doc, and thank you, Kofi, for this really refreshing, recount. I think two quick ones. The first one is that we have to admit that the challenge with high-level accountability in Ghana goes back to at least a decade. And perhaps some rightly say that oil has been a curse in this country because it has been assumed that enough revenue will come in to help us with the development of the country. And so maybe we misused it, or we didn't ask the right question to the right people who are supposed to be managing the wealth of this country. Now, I have to stop here a little bit at something you mentioned earlier when you were talking about dissociating from politics for this particular session. I think it's not possible to dissociate because there's politics in everything in life. So even if you want to discuss economics or cooking with your wife or playing with your kids or governance issues with government, there's politics in everything. And so to tie the reason why I'm mentioning this and to tie it into what Kofi is saying, there's no one person in government in Ghana who can actually summarize the whole system. It's a system. And so whether the Minister of Finance or the President of Ghana or the Chief of Staff or whoever it is, it's a system. And accountability is about being able to design the checks and the balances that allows you to ask the right questions and get the right answers back. And that is where I think we had issues with mismanagement at a high level. It's not because you are not competent. And I know, and it goes back to politics. People toss the word competence and it's very politically charged. But it's about the team's competence. It's not about a person's competence. Because no matter which Minister of Finance cannot control the various, let's call them the cost centers from across the country. You can't be a Minister of Finance and be able to successfully plug each and every hole where the money sinks through. It has to come from various instruments. And in Ghana here, I can mention at least 4 very important and critical examples of public accountability areas we have. We have the Controller and Accountant General's Department, which is supposed to provide oversight on hiring, public financial management, and similar. We have the Public Procurement Authority, which is supposed to look into the contracts that have been granted by government to various groups. We have the Special Prosecutor Office, which is a very interesting topic that was recently set up. I would say it's a failed experiment so far, with all due respect to all the SPOs who have come. But so far, the expectations have been much higher of what we have seen, because the Special Prosecutor Office was someone who was going to target high-level cases and to bring back money that was lost by misappropriation in some certain ways. And then you have the most fundamental component in our country, which is the Parliament. Now, Parliament is supposed to be the oversight over the way the day-to-day operations. And now, but there are some elements that are preventing us from dissociating and separating the various powers in order to build a system of checks and balances that will allow us to restrain the excesses in the spending. So when I know that money is coming in the next decade or 2 or 3, because I have oil, gold, diamond, bauxite, whatever, so I start spending today, things will happen eventually. And now let me get back to some examples, because I've heard the question about whether there has been real development in Ghana over the past decade. And I tell people, look, there has been a lot of development in Ghana. If you look around and you don't see the development, you'll be blind. The Ghana of 5 years ago is not the same as the Ghana of today. And the Ghana of 10 years ago is not the same as the Ghana of 5 years ago. So we have been rapidly developing. However, where we faltered was with the accountability to the cost of development. And I think the cost of our development has been too inflated. And I give the simple example. I tell people that Mercedes-Benz is a fine car. An S-Class is such a fine car. When you're driving an S-Class, you are driving a very good car. But you don't need to pay $1 million to ride the Benz car. And in Ghana, I think for the past decade, we have been buying lots of Benz cars for $1 million. And whatever a Benz car is a Benz is a Benz. It should be able to account for the cost and where the money went and how to bring back whatever excess waste happened. So for the time being, I think I will land my case here. And we will build on the discussion as we have.
Thank you, Ziad, for an interesting opening salvo. So I know that this question of separation of powers is something that Kofi knows quite a bit about. He's a lawyer after all, and maybe let me give Kofi a chance to jump in on this particular point.
Right. So we have a weird situation in Ghana when it comes to separation of powers. We elected in our previous constitution, and let me give this background, which is useful to understand what I'm going to say. We had a military dictatorship under Chairman Rawlings, and all of us, including myself, agitated for constitutional rule. He had been in power for 19 years, and we wanted him to go. And there was a lot to say, but in short, what we needed was to transit into a constitutional era. And none of our previous constitutions at that time had lasted more than 5 years. So we were very afraid that we could transition, but then we could easily go back into, military rule, because that particular man, Jerry Rawlings, had put in a constitution and then come back and did another coup. So we were all looking for a constitution that would be stable. We were looking for stability. With that in mind, we wrote a constitution. And when we developed our parliament, we were thinking about stability. We have something that happened in our history where the father of this Minister of Finance, his name is Johnson Foriata, who was then in parliament, led a revolt against the then government, against the budget that they had put before the then parliament. Essentially, they sent the budget back and said, we don't accept your expenditure here and there, cancel this, change this, do this. So they basically did not pass the president's budget. It went back, they had to work, something out, and it was some sort of a small crisis. Now, for some people, for many people, that was instability. And there is this maxim that even though there's separation of powers, the various arms of government must work together. So in crafting our new parliament, we made a law, put it in our constitution, that 50% of the ministers of any executive will be drawn out of parliament, with the thinking that then they will be part of making the decisions that the executive will be bringing into parliament, so that by the time it gets into parliament, there will almost be a consensus. Remember, we were looking for stability. We wanted this constitution to work. We didn't want all this acrimony and fighting, and then somebody gets up and overthrows it. So we did this thing. Let me say, I was against it from day one. I didn't think it made sense. And honestly, my fears have been, proven to be right. Because the whole purpose of parliament is to be a check on the executive. So my argument is that what happened in Joseph Verata's time was actually parliament being effective. This is what parliaments must do. If the executive just gets up and says, I want to spend this money, do this and that, there must be some place where they can be checked. And on that occasion, they were checked. So for somebody to constitute that into instability did not make sense to me. But hey, we needed this stability. And in fact, there were a number of things in the constitution. For instance, the transitional provisions which made it unlawful to go after people who had even killed people during the revolution. But we still accepted all these things because we wanted to transit into this constitutional rule. That one thing we did to pull 50% of ministers from parliament has effectively emasculated our parliament today. So they are not able to check our executive. Everything the executive wants, it gets. This is the only time we've had a parliament which is a hung parliament. There's a 50%, opposition party power in parliament. And they have made an attempt to check the executive, and they failed on every attempt, including a time when it degenerated into fisticuffs in parliament. So this separation of powers problem is something we're having to deal with very, directly in Ghana today. And if we ever amend our constitution, one of the things I would want to see amended is that provision that 50% of ministers should come from parliament. We should take it out so parliament can be an effective check on the executive.
Okay, so this is a very interesting conversation. And I know that the South Africans in the room, and we have a fair number of South Africans in the room, will also be saying, this sounds somewhat familiar. Correct me if I'm wrong, John. I think this is a chance for you to jump in, because I certainly see the question of we're looking for stability in a government, and we are willing to look anyway. Let me leave you to say it, put it in your own local way.
Well, yes, my heart was bleeding really when I was listening to the story, because we've just been through a process of state capture. I used to spend a lot of time in Ghana in the ruling days trying to sell airliners to the airline and to the government. And I remember what it was like in those days. I remember getting packs of Sadie. You would get like this. And I was so excited by the changes that happened to Ghana. And it's just so sad to see this happening. But you talked about the oil curse, the natural resources curse, the effect that can have. And then the emphasis on democracy is, of course, fantastic. Yet in an environment where you have a large amount of money going to a few people without the institutions in place and without the checks and balances, and with the possibilities of doing maybe in a less dramatic way of what happened in South Africa of maybe diminishing, let's say, the influence of the checks and balances, the mechanisms that make that money be well spent, reducing the transparency. The real life situation is that it just shows how easy it is for an economy and a people as extraordinary as Ghana's has been to come to this stage. And I think the question is, what's the difference between the academic perspective and the principled perspective on how you make a country work? And what happens in real life so quickly? What should and could have been done and what actually could be done now, not in some aspirational way, but in real life, what could happen? And for me, that's the big question we have to grapple with, because we all share this and it's not going to solve it on its own.
But, John, one of the things, and I'm kind of adding to what you're saying, is that in a way, what we all want when we come out of military dictatorships, and we have wanted or other unsavory, non-constitutional situations, is stability, because we don't want a return. So every constitution, I know in Nigeria, we, earnestly negotiated a constitution, constitutional assembly, consultations, drafts, and so forth. And South Africa went through, a similar process after apartheid. So we looked for stability. Stability is a very useful thing, especially after you come out of a period of instability. So one can see the benefit of trying to minimize instability. But how does it end up going away from that and becoming the search for stability leads to instability? It's like, it's one of those contradictions. And I see your point about separation of powers and so forth. But, I think the word here, the issue comes here is that there has to be a boundary to how far we can go, because we all want what you've got, so to speak. Everybody looks at Ghana, and even now, as you say, Ghana is a role model. It's not collapsing. There are no bread queues, there are no riots, But so it is stable, But what is not stable, there's something not stable. So I'm trying to put these things together,
Let me say one other thing. Yeah. In a situation like this, it's a simple strategic thing. You can work on the lagging measures, the things you've got in front of you. The real art is, what are the leading indicators? What are the things you've really got to focus on now to make that situation genuinely change? And obviously, there are institutional issues, there are the governance issues, there's international pressure, there's local pressure. But clearly, without education, without robust and a diverse economy, without the capacity to have transparency and control of use of finance, and without holding the government and beyond, we don't like to talk about presidents because wonderful people can allow situations to get out of hand. Without the transparency and the capability to hold people to task, what are the chances of doing it? So I think these are very tricky situations where the seeds of change are fundamental and quite hard to handle and require a lot of courage.
Right. I think we've learned a few lessons. Indeed, in the past decade, that's 10 years back, because way back President Mills' time, it was clear, very clear to some of us, and many people, not myself alone, that our constitution had outlived its usefulness. We have achieved the stability, and it was time, it was exigent, it was extremely crucial that we amended it from a constitution that delivered stability to a constitution that delivered development. And in voting for stability and erring on the side of stability, we had created an imperial precedence. We had put too much power in the hands of, just a few people. And let me make this point because it connects to this. Our present problems are not directly economic problems. They are governance problems which manifest in economic terms. What I mean is this. You have an overbearing and overpowerful executive which cannot be controlled even by a hung parliament. They can do everything they want to do. Like I said, the Minister of Finance picked up his phone and raised $2.5 billion. Who does that? And that bill is the government. As we speak, he's been able to raise on the Euro market $13 billion. Okay, and basically can get whatever he wants. Now, we did that because we wanted stability. But very quickly, at least 10 years now, we've known that this is a problem. Now, not solving it in the past 10 years, there was a President Mills, who tried. He set up a constitutional review committee, but everything has to be legally sound. That was not too legally sound. Okay, so it didn't go far. But the point is, we did not get down to reviewing the constitution to put the necessary checks and balances, and then Ziad's accountability, etc., place them in, and then, get a handle on these things before they run away. Once we didn't do that, they ran away. So you have very good people like we are discussing now, who, because they could, just basically, blew up the town. So they are governance problems manifesting in economic terms. And we have to get a handle on it now before these economic problems become national security problems. Then the stability we are looking for, we will go back to losing it. All right. So for me, I know there are short-term things we need to do, get a handle on this, get an IMF in, and a couple of things to, get us from sliding down any further. But ultimately, the solution to this thing is to fix what caused it to happen in the first place, which is an overbearing and overpowerful executive capable of getting everything it wanted without effective checks and balances. That's what we need to do.
So we've got a governance issue. We've not got an economic problem. We have a governance problem. Is this the soundbite I'm going to go with on this? Yes. Now, one of the things that you...
If you give me 1 minute, let me just add to it so you can have a better beef on that. We've been to the IMF 17 times. The proof that our problem is governance is that every time we go to the IMF, very quickly we get back on track, which is what I call adult supervision. Immediately somebody is checking, we get back on track, which tells you that our problem is not economics. The fundamentals are sound. People talk about the oil case. Our type of oil case is not really the other one. Our cocoa industry is still good. What is affecting the cocoa industry is illegal mining, not oil. So anytime we get an IMF in town, anytime we get what I call adult supervision, we get quickly back on track. So governance is the problem, not the economics.
Okay. Now, one other thing I want to take us to is, because I know that we had a conversation earlier on for today, we're talking about, and someone has asked a question about corruption. And I think it's already been hinted at, there is a tendency, and this is unfortunate, that whenever there's a problem in the economy across the continent, people point the finger at corruption and they point the finger at the resource curse. In fact, we have this in the Q&A. Somebody has already brought it up. That is this because of oil? Now, I'm not so convinced that it is a foregone conclusion that natural resources lead to trouble. We have other countries who have done fairly well without having ended up there. But nonetheless, the corruption issue, this is one of those things which it's a governance issue. Corruption is also a governance issue, in my view. Now, to what extent is this? I know someone was telling me, I think it was you who mentioned that it's not corruption per se; it's conflict of interest. Now, maybe let me give Ziad a couple of minutes to speak on this, and I'll come back to you, Kofi. Ziad.
Thanks, Doc. Well, so much has been said, and I don't know when my next slots come. But let me give 3 quick ones before answering your questions. The first one, to put into perspective what Kofi was talking about what we refer to as Article 78, Section 1 of the 1992 Constitution, which gives the president the ability to appoint more 50% from the House of Parliament. Suppose you have 137 members of Parliament out of 275 in total as a ruling party. And suppose that you want to have a cabinet, a government of about anywhere between 80 to 100 ministers. And if half of that will have to come from your own MPs from within your government, you're talking about 40 or 50 members of parliament from your own party, from parliament, who are already part of your share. That's already, in my definition, that's already a conflict of interest, because who is going to come and put a check and balance on his president to tell him you are wrong? Eventually, he's a public servant, and the president has the discretion of reappointing ministers as well. We always forget that. Oh, that's mighty power. So no matter any minister, it's just a minister, it's just a public servant. So that's the first point. The second one is the fact that I think in Ghana, it got to a point where many years ago, the difference between the political appointments and the civil servants have eroded. And so the politicians have begun to encroach into the critical level of senior public servants who are supposed to be part of their agencies and untouched, unbiased by the changes at the political top. There has to be a political representation at the very top. Eventually, governance is politics are intermingled. But then the encroachment gets to some point where eventually the agencies start to get overhauled during changes of government, and that erodes the high quality of public service. And that also blurs the line between public service and politics. Public service is not necessarily the same as politics. As today, public servants do not feel that they are protected from the political cycles in their country. And so whether they are prepared to do the right thing or not, which is where corruption comes in, but they are already being eroded as part of their political appointments. So when this arrives, you are giving too much power to the political appointees. And so I think we need to look at checks and balances to reinstate this difference between the political appointees and public servants who function as the institutional memory of their agencies. If that doesn't happen, we continue to have an erosion in the performance and competitiveness of our agencies as we want. The very last point, which has to do with conflicts of interest. Look, my background is a bit interesting to this because I come from a family business. And interestingly, family businesses are a microcosm of everything that can happen in the country at a wide level. So there's the business, there's politics, there's the advocacy, there's the day-to-day interactions, and there's the public service. And then there's the separation of duties, conflicts of interest, and then you have to manage all of this. So I look at it from a different way. You don't need to be to separate the conflicts of interest from the friends and families. So you can be friends and family, I can still be a competitive one. But that still doesn't give you the whip to craft, to hold corruption in check. If you can restrain yourself and your group, that doesn't necessarily flow to the rest of the ruling group, so to say. And it remains the burden and the responsibility of the top gentleman or the lady of the land to hold the highest political appointees in check to make sure that they do the right thing to the interest of the nation, not to the interest of the party. Parties are important, but nations go beyond. And I think we have to start to elevate ourselves in our discussions from partisan politics to national politics. I think we have started to go down in the quality of our discussions and conversations across parties, and we're talking too much partisan politics. I think we have to go back to the roots and think about national interests.
Oh, thank you. So it's a very interesting set of points. So one of the things that you are saying here is that separating politicians from bureaucrats, or the civil service should stay intact, and civil service should remain neutral, and the civil service then provides that kind of check, is a sort of a natural check to the encroachment of politicians into the implementation of policy. Is this what you kind of seem to be suggesting?
Or at least they can provide unbiased service and opinion when needed. So as long as you have an unbiased base of civil service, then you will at least have the evidence base that allow you to make the decisions. Whether you decide to make the decisions in the interest of the nation or in the interest of your party or in your personal interest, that's the thing together. But I think it's important to preserve this difference.
There's that very interesting program on the BBC a number of years ago called Yes Minister, which I'm sure many people here have watched. And it's the story essentially of how, for those few people who may not have seen anything about it, it's a story of essentially of how the buttons are being pressed by the civil servants who are much more competent than the politicians who come and go. And I suppose that's one of the features of at least I think it's been a feature of most European civil services. They provide a stability regardless of the coming and goings of politicians. I don't know what the situation in South Africa is. So I'm going to give John this. John, you want to come in on this point?
Yeah, I do. I think regrettably we have something to offer in South Africa on this point, because we went through some really hard issues of arguably, the country being taken over by a political elite, the erosion of free speech, of the press, of the security agencies, the prosecution agencies. In fact, every which way there was a way to do this. And when you have massive wealth floating around, of course, in our case, there was this idea of redressment, and one would argue my turn to eat that came up. And it was very easy to polarize the debate. And of course, we would have people like Bell Pottinger come in and work and use PR tactics to articulate these, using what we would find in fake science, fake news, and deep fakes going on. So you're dealing with something very difficult. The situation is, how do we reverse? What are the breaks and gaps? And so you can reverse this by creating political opposition groups. Incredibly hard. By advocating and then giving examples for responsible political behavior, for really trying to work on and publicizing judicial independence, activating civil society, all of which is very dangerous in its own way for those actors in the middle of it. And I deeply respect your positions, Kofi and Ziad, in this respect. And also somehow activating business as a separate entity as well. And so how do you diversify business and then work on the leading indicators of education and making a big noise about corporate best practice? None of these are silver bullets. It's a combination of factors that maybe will start to put a brake on and raise the level of arguments and clarity to a point where you can really act. But without, and I think that's what one would be facing in a situation like this, a complex set of activities to arguably start reversing the decline and publicizing the consequences of these actions on the people, not just on an abstract government or country.
So John has, asked more than once, so what should we do? What could we do? How do we reverse, these things? And I think really that's where my thinking also is. And in terms of the structure, in terms of principle, I've always said that structure regulates behavior. So if there's a structure built around you and you can only go forward, you are going to go forward, because going back is going to cost you too much and you may not succeed. And in this context, structure is law. I don't think Ghana per se lacks people who are prepared to take on our governments. And like I said, we are pretty calm people, but in our parliament, we ended up with fisticuffs. Now, this is a parliament where the minority was so strong, they managed to engineer the election of a speaker and beat the majority in doing so. That tells you they have their ways. So there's a bit of strength. And this is a Ghana where civil society is pretty strong. I've led a few demonstrations, and there are so many people who will tell you that it is not too wise to challenge the Ghanaian middle class, because it's been proven over and over again that when we have to, we will. I can tell you that part of why there's not much movement and things going around right now is because most of it will end in futility. There is consensus across about what needs to be done. The problem is that it all ends on the president's table. So, for instance, there's broad, consensus that the Minister of Finance has to go, even just on principle that, some of the things that have happened make his position untenable. The president simply says, no, I'm not going to fire him, period. The parliament passed the vote of censure, and they were going to move from parliament to have him removed. Well, at the end of the day, they managed to pull through using the power of the executive. One of the people who chaired that censure motion today has been appointed to a ministerial position and is going through vetting as we speak. So you have a situation where the structure today does not even give room for activism to succeed, because ultimately we end up on the president's table. So what should we do? One, we need to know that we have to build Rome every day. And again, I say that as a Ghanaian, we have taken so many things for granted, that we are this type. We never had a civil war in Ghana. When we have issues, we sit down and we talk about it. We've never had a default, all those, so we never get there. No, we've proven that we can go there. So we need to consistently work on this country to preserve what we built, but we need to now build structures that will deliver to us the things that we need. Then activism, then the people in power who want to do whatever they want to do, whether they're in the civil service or in parliament, know that if they take a certain stand, the system will support them. So we need to fix those structural problems, and then you'll see bravery come up.
Can I come in, Doc?
Yeah, come. Do please come in. Yes.
Just a quick one, because I just realized that we have been talking about the cost of stability during the conversation throughout. And it appears to me as if we are discussing it at the cost of political stability. And I just want to emphasize the fact that there's also a cost of economic stability. And so this led me right now to think to myself that I wonder up to what point would the economic stability still be to outweigh the benefits of the constitutional amendment that is required to push this country forward? Or in other words, if I want to rephrase, at what point would stability outweigh the benefits of reform for our constitution? And it's important because remember that the business community also seeks economic stability. And if you do not provide the kind of stability that is required for them to predict your regulations, your rules, your laws, your competitiveness, your factors of production, they will not be interested in coming in and helping you to resuscitate your economy and to make your economy develop. So you might be developing your infrastructure, but then the rules and the regulations and the framework that allows the enabling effect of a thriving private sector will no longer take effect. So we also have to take into consideration that fact, that we also need to think about the economic cost of reform.
This is a very nice point, yeah. In fact, there's often a trade-off that people are willing to give up political stability and democratic institutions when there is economic stability or economic growth. I mean, we take the case of Singapore, where people are willing to give up certain freedoms in exchange for a very vibrant economy. And as long as the government provides that vibrant economy, jobs for everyone, people are willing to look the other way with the question of of voice for everybody, and and so on. And this is, of course, true. Also in some other countries where we have high economic growth and they give up political freedoms for in exchange for economic opportunity. Now, I suppose this is a kind of an interesting philosophical debate: is how what is more important to and if everyone feels they're getting a slice of the national cake, then if there are conflicts of interest, so what? Everyone is doing well out of this. I'm willing to look the other way. Now, this, of course, is not the case. Now, one of the I just realized as I see the message, there's a comment from Yusuf Lenge, is a gentleman known to me, and from Nigeria. And I think this is a context I want to steer this to. He's asking, would the panelists consider Ghana a free market, especially with the highlight of IMF supervision? How much do free market dynamics influence the situation? Now, coming to the reason I raise this is, it will not be immediately clear, is that we think of state capture, which is, John brought up the issue of state capture, regulatory capture, and so forth, as a price, sometimes as something as we pay, which means that the market is entirely free because big actors are controlling this. But one of the things that people and this is where we start talking about corruption, and that a story in South Africa comes out of corruption. Now, as a Nigerian, my first thought, of course, is that corruption is not the issue here. I mean, it's not at the same scale as what we look at in Nigeria. But maybe you guys on the ground can speak to this. Is this? And I think you said this somewhere before, Kofi, that it's not really about corruption, it's about conflict of interest. Is this a continuum that we need to consider? At what point in time does corruption become the main issue? So
corruption is always a problem. And yes, we do have corruption in Ghana, and there are various aspects of corruption which have led to where we are. But look, it is a very nuanced situation, especially here in Ghana. I will not defend the Minister of Finance if he's accused of corruption in this matter. Now, I can say this for a fact because it's true. I have known him for almost 30 years. And on a personal level, I know he's not a materialistic person. Everybody who knows him knows that. You'll be surprised he drives a Ghana-made car even now. He's lived in the same house for over 40 years, and it's a very modest house in the same neighborhood. I could go on and on and on. Anybody who knows Ken Ofori-Atta knows that. He's been worth millions of dollars, but he's never lived that kind of life. And nobody thinks that he's at this point trying to, amass wealth for himself. However, it will be difficult to continue to push that when the fact again is made that he or his company, that is DataBank, have been the book runners for the Eurobond loans of 13 billion thereabouts that Ghana has gone in for. In other words, when Ghana was taking loans and getting into debt, his company or himself were getting rich. That is a form of corruption. That clearly is a conflict of interest. And if I were his advisor, I would say, stay away from that stuff. But he didn't. And so anybody who accuses him of that will be absolutely right to accuse him of corruption by virtue of a grievous conflict of interest situation that he's put himself in. He has also created a situation where, so you have all kinds of, so they've been accused of nepotism, cronyism, and all those things, and not all of it can be defended adequately. However, I keep repeating, for me, we have this situation where what the problem is that we are unable to keep honest men honest in Ghana. Okay? People will be happy to go about their business and make their money. You have contractors in Ghana who build or pad their fees, and they pad their costs, etc., because they know they will not be paid on time. And they have taken a bank loan, and there will be an interest of X. So they put it on top, and that makes our roads more expensive than the average road. There are so many situations which look like corruption, But really, when you look at it, it is not so much corruption as it is a bad governance arrangement that gives incentive for people to do things out of plain rational economic behavior, and then to be able to get away with that, they will bribe somebody here or there. So I think, again, if we put the right structures in place, I mean, why do we have to go and contract millions of dollars worth of projects that we cannot pay for, and therefore they run into all kinds of problems, and then these guys have to pad it? We create these unnecessary problems. All right. So yes, we do have a corruption problem, but in Ghana it is pretty nuanced. And again, I agree with Zia that we have all these anti-corruption agencies, and part of the reason why they have not seen that much action is because the corruption again is nuanced. If you take the Office of the Special Prosecutor, well, we know that Ken Ofori-Atta has benefited from the loans that we've taken because his company, Data Bank, has benefited from being the book runners. But Ken Ofori-Atta has resigned from that position. He's not benefiting directly. The benefit is indirect. All right. Are you going to accuse him of corruption? Can the Office of the Special Prosecutor go after him? Then again, we know Ken Ofori-Atta's company, Data Bank, even though if you accuse them of conflict of interest, they have been leaders in this industry for the past 25 years. They've been doing this since, long. And it's not because Ken Ofori-Atta is making them do it. Are you going to say because they've been, their chairman is, or the former chairman is now minister, they should lose their business? You can't say that. So you have these cases which neither the AG can prosecute or the special prosecutor can prosecute. And then you have a situation where sometimes it is the exercise of discretion. The person exercised their discretion wrongly. And when they exercise it wrongly and things go wrong, you can't accuse them of corruption. Maybe they were induced to exercise the discretion wrongly, but the fact is it was given to them. They have the power, like the president has, to exercise that discretion. So we do have a corruption problem. But again, I think these are governance problems, structural, legal, constitutional problems, which are manifesting in other ways. The solution is not to put people in jail per se. The solution is to close these loopholes. Then you will find the actual thieves and corrupt persons.
So you're saying that, and I'm coming to you, John. So you're saying that essentially there are holes that exist in governance, and the fact that people exploit them is what you would consider to be garden variety corruption, which is kind of makes sense. Okay, if you give me an opportunity,
some of it is rational behavior. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not, and I want to say this for the Nigerian audience, we're not talking the same scale of corruption, which I'm going to save that conversation for the next. We're going to do a webinar on Nigeria in a couple of months' time once the new government comes in. But I'm going to leave that one alone for now. But I think also I want to say for the audience that Nigeria and Ghana, we're not looking at the same sort of problem. And the tendency is to use corruption as a generic issue across countries, where it's a very different kind. There's not just one. Corruption doesn't come in the same shape and form or intensity. It's something that I want to come back to talk about at some case, the extent to which it causes government failure, and that government is subsumed into state capture. There's a continuum here, which I think, but I will save this conversation because it's something that's got my attention right now. Now, I want John seemed very eager to join in here, so do.
Well, I would like to say something. I remember I was working for British Aerospace in the 1980s. I was leading a trade mission to Ghana, of all places, and the High Commissioner said to me, "Will you please, when we go and see the Prime Minister, PVO Bang, say to him, we are worried about the increasing corruption in the timber sector." And I, in my naivety, did. And PVO Bang turned to me and he said, "Mr. Foster Pedley, it takes two to corrupt." And so it does. There is always another party. And there I was, a representative looking like me of a multinational from there, having the temerity to say it to them, and he pointed the fingers right back at me. But the issue is not even that. Surely the point is about prosperity for the people, If you are in a governance situation, whatever it is, you are mandated by that position to support the prosperity and well-being of others. Now, you can call it corruption or nothing. If you are facilitating that and you don't act on it, and you allow those processes and other people to capture it, and you benefit in whatever way, so the country suffers, people suffers. Whether you call it corruption or not, maybe it is corruption on steroids. or maybe it is subverting the public interest on steroids, but the damage caused to people is massive. And whether you make that criminal or whatever, you are still causing damage. Maybe state capture can be even legal. You could find legal ways to support, but it's not legitimate. And that's the point. This is an incredibly illegitimate process, and voices of legitimacy we need to make them stand out. We have to make these cases that just because it's legal doesn't mean it's okay. And I'm sure, and that is really, really important. You don't have a legitimate position. None of us do if you are allowing the mass of people for whom you are purportedly serving to suffer. That's not okay. And we have to find ways to speak out.
Now, again, I'm going to be very cautious. I
just wanted to add to that point because Mr. Foster Pedley is very right. And this is where I am going when I keep talking about structure. So what we need to do is to redefine some of these things which are on the borderline of corruption as straight up corruption. Because you really have a mandate and I think that politicians must not be held to the criminal standard of proof beyond doubt. They must be held to the higher standard of trust because that is how they campaign. So what he's saying is that, look, yes, you have a mandate and you should appreciate that. You need to do things that ultimately inure to the benefit of people. However it gets distracted, we should define it in the terms that necessarily will stop those things. So I agree with changing the structures and definitions of some of these things. Conflict of interest is corruption. Let us just make it like that. You can't be a finance minister and have a company that you have shares in doing this and this and this. Let's stop the gray area stuff and make it black and white in many cases, because that's what we are facing in Ghana today. Really, we need to change the structure to make the things that we don't like prescribed.
Now, this is very good advice, and I'm again one of the things that I'm waiting for to see the fallout of the Nigerian election before I say anything, because I have to admit I have a conflict of interest, possible conflict of interest, given that I am fairly close to some of the people who have just got elected, and I may well have some kind of advisory role going forward. So I don't want to say too much. It's all fresh, but what I want to come to, and of course, yes, I agree, conflict of interest, corruption. None of this is right. There is, one should eliminate all these loopholes in governance. It is a very important thing to be done. Now, one of the comments, Christian Lewis is asking this question, and it's something that I'd like to also bring up. You brought up the adult supervision thing. Now, 17 times around, you've had to go to go and get money to have adult supervision. Now, many countries have gone gone in for structural adjustment or what have you, and not everyone has come out successfully. But not only has Ghana done so successfully, it's done so successfully 17 times or 16 times. Now, it begs the question, why is Ghana so well behaved that the adult comes to the room and starts behaving itself? And then why do you have to go there? I mean, surely 16 times, at some point in time, you burn your finger, you burn your finger again. At some point in time, you stop putting your hand in the fire. Yeah. Now, this is really where it's putting it very simply. I know that Christian Lewis has put it a little bit more eloquently. He says, if adult supervision is needed, it could mean that values and ethics are the problem. How is the country trying to change this? Okay, so these are, let me just, why don't you just take it as it is and free.
I can start. So yeah. They are all right to say if you've gone in and come out 17 times successfully, then really your issue is not serious. And that is the frustration we Ghanaians have. I have had meetings with the IMF, and I remember telling at the time it was a World Bank. I remember telling the World Bank country manager that I don't like seeing you guys here, because every time I see you take over, I see the failure of my country. And I said that it's because you don't really do anything serious. As an activist, as an analyst, if you go online now and you Google what Imani has written about our current economic situation, I dare say, at the risk of sounding immodest, that our analysis on the issue and our predictions about way forward and suggestions are better quality than the consultants of the Ministry of Finance who are paid millions of dollars. The things that IMF tells us, there are enough people in this country who have said the same things over and over again, consistently. They just don't listen to us. So it's very sad, and that's where the issue of values, etc., come in. But I will keep going back to this point. It is not so much that the Minister of Finance doesn't know or doesn't have values, or the President doesn't know or doesn't have values. It is because they can do so without consequence. So they go ahead and do so without consequence, which is why we need to change the structure. If it's a one way, then the law says you have to go in only one direction. If you go in the opposite direction, you should be arrested. We need to change it. Then you would have a situation where the adult supervision comes through laws. All right? Instead of just leaving it to people out of the goodness of their hearts to observe them. So the person is right by saying that it's a matter of values and ethics. Since you can do it, you just did it, even though you knew it wasn't right. I think now we cannot trust ourselves to be ethical or to exercise good values. So let's just put it in law.
So ethics. So expecting people to behave badly out of the simply as a matter of principle or as a matter of human decency is something we should not assume.
We should not. It is not smart, actually, when you don't have any basis to expect that a person is going to operate by a very high moral standard. I mean, you don't expect Al Capone to operate by a very high moral standard. But maybe somebody who is close to Al Capone should also not be expected to operate by a very high moral standard. And if you are in doubt, it is not wise to give that person that room. And if you've given that person that room consistently 17 times over 60 years, and they consistently fail, everything tells you that you must change it and not give them that discretion.
This is a very, very interesting point.
Can I give a different perspective to the same topic?
All right. Yes, please. This will be a good idea.
Different perspective, and the different perspective, but in the same direction. I don't know how exactly to look at it. I think I agree with the fact of adult supervision, but maybe the terminology is what I'm not very sure about. Because if you are able to trigger the levers of power 17 times successfully, it means you have the machinations and you have the capacity to set off in a particular reform path at will whenever you decide to do that or whenever you are forced to do that. And the fact that you don't do that, it means you are not being pushed in that direction hard enough. And so I think that instead of adult supervision, I think the average Ghanaian has forgotten what are his rights. And I think that some of the institutions that build it and educate the constituents about what they need, what they want, and what they must have is not there. We have something called the National Commission for Civic Education in Ghana, which is supposed to be the main organization that educates Ghanaians about their rights, their obligations, or the laws, what they should expect from elections, what they should do in terms of certain issues, prices and things like that. But we understaff it intentionally because for some reason we feel that we don't need to educate people about what full rights and obligations are. For some reason, maybe nefarious reasons, maybe laziness. But I think a politician will only do what he is asked to do when he sees that he is faced with constituents who insist that he goes in a certain direction, or if he feels that this is exactly what he thinks or he feels that they want. And that's why you can see sometimes some of the politicians who pull out some interesting shenanigans, and you find out that their constituents are clapping because they're happy. That's what the constituents want. That's what he's doing. And so at times, if you put in your weight in the right instances and the right moments, if you request that your politicians do the right thing or do something, then they will do it. However, I think we need to build a culture to root out corruption. And once you build a culture to root out corruption, then you will force your elected constituents to do the right thing in a way that would build the systems of checks and balances from the people. I'm not saying that would work all the time, but I'm saying that if you don't invest into the civic education, then the values will continue to erode. And the representation and the manifestation of that will be in lousier politicians as we move on. And there's nothing worse than having a bad politician exercise his full power in the wrong direction. That will eventually lead you into trouble.
John, I think again
Ziad's last point, that will eventually lead you into trouble. I think you could take out the eventually and say very rapidly. And so, you're talking about social engagement, awareness of the rights of people and our citizen rights, if you like, and teaching that. Obviously, there are disincentives for less than benign regimes to do that. In fact, we see everywhere that people are trying to close that down. So if that is the leading indicator that's going to make that happen over time, then you can't rely on government to do that for you, because it's like asking turkeys to vote for Christmas. So you've actually got to be extremely activist yourself to make sure that you say that, and you have to do what you're doing, speak out and do this. Now, of course, when you speak out, you will be occasionally and maybe often wrong, because these are opinions. And of course, the forces against that will be well-resourced, and you can expect a lot of personal challenge. And so this is a difficult path. So at the end, if we are going to do this, we have to talk and open and praise people who do it, support the whistleblowers. And I'm not saying that this is a whistleblower economy. I'm saying we need to work together to build prosperity in an extremely imperfect world. And so I would agree with you. At the same time, what do we do in the short term to reverse these tendencies? And that is something that we also have. So we have to work medium and long term in balance. And you can't get away with that with letting go of either. And this is never going to be easy, is it? I think.
Yeah. I really struggle with this problem. As you say, there's a long-term issue and a short-term issue. But, it's still... The point of the matter is that it seems like a cancer. We extricate the cancer, as you say, adult supervision or adult surgery, and then everyone's fine. Laws are followed, rules are obeyed. We stay within the bounds of normal behavior, and then gradually we deviate from the normal behavior, and the cancer is back, and then we go back to the IMF, extract it, come back again, and then we do this again. Is this a natural thing that we can expect forevermore? We just stay on the cycle of things. There is a long-term question here, but I think keeping my eye on the time as well. I think in the shorter run, that is to say, this next cycle of adult supervision, I still want to know why we need adult supervision so often, and is this something that someone hasn't raised it? No one has raised this yet, but I'm going to raise it. Is this a common problem? Do we have IMF has a full-time job in Africa? I was at a meeting in Abuja in December, where the conversation was about also removing lots of impractical things within the budget. So that the outcome is Nigeria has to borrow money. Everyone knows it. Nobody with any comments. But yet everything, business as usual, continues. The money is being drained in ways that it should not be drained. Everybody knows, all the parties know what's going on, but people are still doing it. So are we going to, we are going to have adult supervision very soon at the end of the year in Nigeria. I can't see anything preventing that from happening. But do we have to have adults always in the room? And one of the comments here by Samuel Bonsu, saying that what are Western stakeholders doing to make sure Ghana's governance systems and structures work effectively? I mean, why do we have to turn to Western stakeholders? Is really, it's a matter of shame. How many years post independence can we be turning to Western stakeholders to tell us how to behave? Why should we? Why? Let me ask the question. Kofi first.
Yes. So sometimes I believe in shock treatment. And like I say, if you do not have a basis for believing that somebody can do something by themselves, it does not make sense to leave it to their discretion to do it. I believe the greatest president Ghana has had is Kwame Nkrumah. But I think he was wrong. He was wrong either because he was too far ahead of his time when he said that the African is fundamentally capable of managing his own affairs. It is not that we don't have excellence in Africa. Out of this country, we educated and produced Kofi Annan, okay, who was one of the most successful UN Secretaries General ever. Yeah. Totally uneventful, very successful. I mean, we've produced NASA scientists, and I could go on and on. So we are very capable. At an individual level, there are Nigerians who, I mean, in the US today, the Nigerian group is the most educated of any ethnic group. I mean, I could go on, but I hold the view that as a group, Africans have not gotten to the point where we have built the necessary skills, attitudes, and knowledge, and values and ethics to be able to adequately manage our own affairs. And I am an African. In everything that I do, what I tell my students and everybody is that I cannot confirm that as Africans we will all be the best, but I can ensure that what I do, I will be best at. So I try in every situation. I once had to, be working with a lecturer from the Harvard University. And I told my people, all I want to do is to make sure I'm better than him. And at the end of the day, the students rated me better than him, and I was fine. So the African at a communal level is not capable of managing his own affairs. And that is why we keep seeing everybody going back to the IMF. That is why we see Nigeria, which in my view is the richest country in Africa. Not even South Africa comes close. Okay? Cannot get its act together. They can't get electricity together. All right? And I do believe that if you bring a mediocre company from anywhere in Europe, they will solve the electricity problem in Nigeria. Now, I say this to challenge us because I don't think it makes sense for us to assume that we are capable of doing things that we've not been able to do for 60 years. For that reason, let us buy the expertise, let us buy the set of knowledge, skills, and attitudes, ethics, and values that will help us get beyond a point so children are not dying out of things that they shouldn't die of, and then build those values over time. So it comes back to this IMF. I don't like having the IMF here. But as a Ghanaian, we've been there 17 times. What is the proof that we'll not be there the 18th time? And why do we have to wait and go back? So if you ask me, I'll say we should have a system where either we impose the adult supervision from within in a way that we cannot derogate from, or we should just keep this status quo. And I know how it sounds. I mean, I don't have the time to go into it, colonialism and everything that comes through. But I'm saying that, look, we cannot eat pride. And if all this pride is leading to children dying from cholera and drinking, polluted water and not having hospitals and schools, then I don't want pride. I want kids to grow up in a good environment. So we should face up to the situation that we have weaknesses. And these weaknesses keep coming up. We've had independence for over 60 years, and our problems are cyclical. I can tell you how they look like because they always come back around, and then somebody comes, and the West, the IMF, the World Bank, the Europeans, the Americans, whoever, they don't send us their best. They don't send the best economists to Africa. They send us the guys who they don't want or they don't have spaces for. And these guys come here, and there are many of them I've sat with, and I think if I'm not equal, I'll be better than. We absolutely have better economists and doctors, etc. here. Okay, so what is it that makes a mediocre Western economist come and run an African economy better than the Minister of Finance? We need to face up to these very difficult situations, very difficult realities, and start clawing or crawling out of them.
Wow. I mean, I'm glad we've taped that. That's fascinating. Yeah. I would just like to say one thing, though, that, the thing about adult supervision, Britain has just struggling through Brexit. We certainly need adult supervision too. And so maybe it's part of the argument we can mediate to just nuance that a bit, that it's not national or whatever, It's about having multiple external perspectives. And often these agencies maybe are increasingly a multitude of perspectives which give you the distance to manage and aren't just quoted in nation state versus nation state ideas, because that argument, of course, inflames people to in the ways you've talked about colonialism. But the question there is, how do we get a collective of people with a perspective, with a common interest, which is sufficiently detached to govern and manage? And that's the adult. It's not a Western perspective per se necessarily, but it's a collective of independence who could equally include those diaspora Ghanaians and Croatians and Ghana, and Vietnamese as well.
Yes,
I think
true.
This is one of the. I'm keeping an eye on the time. I know it's dinner time in many countries, so we want to end on precisely at the end of our slot. So I want to kind of bring these things to tie some strings together. Now, I just want to bring up. There was an article by Kofi's colleague Bright Simons in the Financial Times. Was it last week? Was it this week? Anyway, very recently. And one of his main point was that all of this stuff that's going on with the IMF and all the bailout we've talked about covers a very minute part of the thing, and it's half-baked. That's his main point. The whole thing is half-baked. Now, what does that mean? I had in fact invited him to join us, but he was unable to come. But I have a feeling that Kofi, you have some sense of that. What is half baked and what would be full baked?
Right. So, by the way, if you can get Bright, you should get him. It's exhilarating. It's half baked because, like we have all said over and over again, our problems are not economic problems or fiscal problems. They are governance problems that manifest as economic problems. So if everybody is coming in and trying to solve these economic problems, you are going to do a half-baked work, which is why we've gone around 17 times. So our view is that if we need a durable solution, of course, we need to deal with the short-term situation. But quickly, we need to start giving some resource and attention to a more durable, a more long-term solution. Now, we know there's a problem there. The problem is that the IMF cannot run the country. The IMF cannot solve our governance problems. But again, like Mr. Foster Pedley says, we need to put together local and diasporan talent because that goes beyond the IMF. We have some stake, okay? And nobody can accuse us of colonialism or whatever it is and face the hard truth. Now, we can solve the short-term problems with the IMF and co, but if we want durable solutions, we need to quickly follow it up with all these other things that prevent us from going back. One of the points that we've made, and Bright does the publications, is that Africa or Ghana cannot really make a case for debt forgiveness again this time. Okay? I mean, 20 years or so, we were zero debt. We were forgiven in HIPIC. We had zero Eurobond debt, zero. And just in the short span of 20 years, look at us now. And in the debate that led to that publication, I was making the point, for instance, that if we are forgiving all our debts right now, and there is an absolutely 100% assurance that we'll be back in debt in the next 5 years, what's the point of forgiving us the debts? So I am of the view that we need to find short-term solutions, but what we need to do is to figure out a way where we don't keep going around in these debt cycles. If you take Ghana, for instance, we've made $6 billion in oil since we started doing oil. What did we do with that money? So it's a half-baked solution to just think that, papering over this one and getting on with it is going to solve the problem. There will be an 18th time. So we need to get down to solve these problems on a more durable level. And that's where we are going with that publication.
Ziad, some
for a moment I thought Kofi was going to say that the IMF holds a permanent eye for Ghana because 18 is a very special number and you can get there anytime, so it helps you jump the queue. I agree also on the fact that we don't need Western values or Western resource people. We have all we need here. We just need to agree on the values, enshrine the values that helps us to minimize the waste and the leakages from economic development And to do that one is to re-examine our public machinations, our governance structures, and to reinforce the structures. I believe that we really need to review the Constitution in some ways to allow it to become less flexible to the manipulations of the whims of the politicians. Eventually, we all love our Ghana. We all share our love for Kwame Nkrumah. We know that he was a flawed human being. We are all humans. We all have our flaws. But he was the man of his time. Today, we are in the 21st century. I can dial ChatGPT and I can find at my fingertips. I can unlock the vast intelligence of the whole world. So I can be my own. I can be my own computer. So we have the technology, we have the resources, we have the talents. We need to just make sure that we build it into a system that allows us to grow and develop our economies and our human resources with the minimum of waste. Otherwise, we keep on going backwards or stalling, and then we keep on wishing for someone to forgive our debts several years down the line every time something comes up. It's important.
Yes. No, I think this is these are. I think both set of issues are here. Finding our feet. And I agree with Ziad that 18 is really not a good number. And technically, when you get to 18, you're an adult. You should not be having adult supervision once you are legally an adult, even though it's taken 70 years to get to be 18. And I think that the number of possible stories coming up across the continent in the next few months, has me concerned. I don't think we're going to answer these questions. I want really, the whole point of this conversation was to begin a conversation. And what I'm going to suggest is that we return to some of these issues. Let Bright come on. We'll bring him on next time to talk about why they're half-baked. And hopefully by the time we come back in 2 or 3 months' time, we can talk about baked solutions as well. I think this is actually, I wanted this to happen now because I know what's about to happen or should happen in Nigeria in the next couple of months. And then this is going to go across the continent to other places. So if we can learn anything from the Ghanaian experience, this will be, I think, the best outcome of today. John, do you have anything in closing you want to...
Yes, I mean, it's intriguing to me. We struggle with these day in, day out, and they're incredibly real issues that face us. I have started in conferences and sessions like this using ChatGPT and other IA bots to position the questions in ChatGPT, and it's fascinating what comes out, for and against. You can get the argument in an instant that lays out the argument. We could have a conference like that. But what remains to me is what really matters. And what really matters is the moral compass, or whatever you like to call it, a sense of engagement with people and providing well-being, welfare, prosperity, and something that is dignified for us as people, because theft and leaving people poor is not dignified. That is what we have to continue to work on. And it strikes me that however imperfect that is, we have to come back to that issue and be able to hold it, because we have the sophistry and depth to provide arguments infinitely for either side of a position. But putting yourself on the line to make our kids' lives better, that requires something more than ChatGPT.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. For me, one of the, there's a couple of comments here which kind of asking about ethics and values, and what I think that having lived now in several continents, and I can say for sure that what is right is right. There isn't a continuum of what is right. I mean, it's not that I was raised in Nigeria. I've grown up, and I've lived in Europe and America and Asia over the last 30 or 40 years. But I do not see a variation on the concept of right and wrong. And it's not that there is this difference in this understanding of ethics. What is this has not been my experience. So it's nothing to do, there's no inherent disadvantage we face in Africa on understanding what is right and wrong. And there never has been that situation. So it comes to governance to some extent, it comes to education, it comes to poverty. And of course, it comes to a certain amount of political economy. How do the political elites share the surpluses, the rents, the benefits that the economy accrues, the development effects? Are they being shared with the political elites or with the masses? Or to what extent is this sharing taking place? Is there any sharing? We can look at Angola where there's no sharing. The political elites keep everything. And then you have other countries where it's more evenly distributed. Now, what are the mechanisms that lead to this more equitable redistribution of wealth? And that's really kind of a political economy question, which I actually am, researchers in Henley are actually engaged with currently. Now, we have hit our time slot, so I'm going to have to say thank you to everyone. You're all coming back. Please note for the next session in a couple of months' time. We'll let's see where the cards fall in the next couple of months, and fingers crossed, we'll be on a good path. Thank you, Ziad. Thank you, Kofi. Thank you, audience, for a wonderful, wonderful Thursday evening. And see you all soon.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Dunning Africa Center. It's not a place, it's a continent-wide conversation. Join us on the first Thursday of every month.